what I'll do is that recording? Okay. 1 second. I will hit play, and then we're just going to be off to the races. Are any other comments or even boundaries that you want to set up before I get started?
So is your plan, just talk to me about sort of the interplay here. Is your plan to just keep it running and we'll talk over it?
Yeah, for the most part, unless you have a broader point, just say, hey, look, can you stop it for a second?
Yeah.
What's really happening here is X. There's plenty of moments, like when I put the time code together, I was like, okay, well, there's plenty of areas where, like, for the example, where he's talking about Warhol, and he's sort of like trying to figure out exactly what the nature of collecting is and what hoarding is and all this stuff. That's not hugely relevant to our conversation. Let's just talk over it. Same with the ads. There's several ads in there. I can try and edit them out at the end, but it might just be easier to just keep talking, because I think I will have lots of questions myself if you don't have comments. So, but please, like, if you want to react to something, just go ahead and react. And don't wait for me. I mean, I can certainly prompt you. I mean, I have a million comments myself, just listening back recently. So, I think that, but I want you guys to be the voices primarily, if that's all right. And I'm going to just go ahead and lead off with the introduction that I wrote, by and large, and then we'll get going. All right.
Great.
Here we go. So we're already recording, and let me hit. Well, I have to back it up for a second.
Moment, the Metropolitan Museum
announced in January, but it took effect today.
2018.
The new policy
Adobe.
All right, here we go.
starting today. If you don't live in New York State, you're going to have to pay a mandatory entrance fee to visit the Metropolitan Museum.
Eyewitness News, ABC 7, New York, March 1st, 2018.
Hold on, sorry, I forgot to give the introduction. You see, I've not done one of these before. All right, hold on. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of ARC's Chat. I'm your host today, John Robinette. Our colleagues are away doing other actual work. Me as a freelancer, I'm a little bit more free to do these things. So today, our episode is called Dragon Psychology 102. Experts react to Revisionist History podcast, Dragon Psychology 101. Okay, so deaccessioning is not new, but it has reached new levels of controversy in the current state of economic hardship facing our institutions at the moment. In the first episode of Season 5 of the podcast Revisionist History, titled Dragon Psychology 101, Malcolm Gladwell asks the question, why not just sell something to pay the bills? And proposes that museums are just hoarding if they refuse to sell amidst trying circumstances that result in mass layoffs and financial hardship. And of course, these are the situations that face most of our institutions now. ARC's Chat has solicited the help of two experts to react to the episode and directly address this challenging question. Robin Cooper, the manager of curatorial affairs at the Indianapolis Museum of Art at Newfields, joins to represent the curatorial and cultural interests at play. And also Nicholas O'Donnell, partner at the law firm Sullivan & Worcester in Boston, who argued on behalf of the museum membership in the now landmark Berkshire Museum deaccession case. And he will provide the legal insight to the discussion. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to hit play. And of course, now it's not.
EW.com/Adobe.
All right.
Starting today, if you don't live in New York State, you're going to have to pay a mandatory entrance fee to visit the Metropolitan Museum.
Eyewitness News, ABC 7, New York, March 1st, 2018.
The new policy was announced in January, but it took effect today. Adults who do not have ID proving that they live right here in New York
As
have to
someone
pay
who lives in New York,
$25.
this was a big
Seniors
deal.
will pay $17.
If I had to pinpoint the beginning of my obsession with art museums, it would be the moment the Metropolitan Museum, one of the greatest museums in the world, decided to impose entrance fees. It was a difficult time for the institution. They had a $40 million deficit. They got rid of 90 employees. exhibitions were canceled. There was a shakeup in the leadership. Up and down the Upper East Side of Manhattan, there was hand-wringing and a great gnashing of teeth. I remember one New York Times headline from that time. Is the Met Museum a great institution in decline? That was followed by one expression of anguish after another, including this from the former chairman of the Met's Drawings and Print Department. To have inherited a museum as strong as the Met was 10 years ago, with a great curatorial staff, and to have it be what it is today, is unimaginable. Well, exactly. Because, for the life of me, I couldn't imagine how it was the Met was crying poverty. I mean,
I
they
think
have
that's
one of the
interesting
largest
because
and
10
most
years ago was
valuable
right
art
after a major
collections in the
recession. So
world.
I'd be surprised if financially
1.5
they really
million
were that
objects.
great.
What's all that art worth? I don't know, $100 billion? More? The Met might be the richest nonprofit institution in human history. All they would have to do is pick a couple things off the shelf, and they'd never see a deficit again. This is like Jeff Bezos firing the gardener because he's out of cash. Just go to the ATM, Jeff. But they couldn't do it. They would rather fire people and make a family of four cough up to $100 at the gate than even think of parting with a single one of their possessions. Why?
Can we pause it real quick there, John? That was so much information.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if Nick has a lot of feedback there, but the way Malcolm introduces this podcast is really polarizing because it's definitely posing the Met as this home for rich people, whereas a family of four wouldn't be able to afford to go. And one of the major problems there is that while the Met certainly is a very wealthy institution, even if they are in debt, and certainly wealthy in terms of objects. As a nonprofit, they have a mission to collect these objects and to present them to the public. And Malcolm never brings that up. He makes it kind of a them versus us sort of right off the bat, which doesn't leave a very good taste in my mouth as someone that works for a nonprofit and understands that your mission is to the family of four that wants to come. And it's never a reason for imposing a admission fee, which my institution also has, isn't to turn people away, it's to ensure that you can continue to welcome them. Right.
Well, and I feel like this, he's sort of he's missing the one critical element, which is that we don't sell them because of the cultural mission. And we specifically do not want to see the objects in a museum as assets to be sold. We don't want to see them, and we've made this sort of societal choice in order to see them as part of the culture and not as money, or not as something to be monetized. So, anything to add to that, Nick?
No, I just think it starts from a very simplistic view of, as you said, the mission of a museum and the complexity of executing that mission. And there is no more complex picture than a place like the Met or one of the very small handful of museums around the world of that size and scope. It's sort of like complaining about Amtrak being cost neutral, right? It sort of misses the point of the larger public mission that the institution is serving. And there are a lot of fair questions that he raises and a lot of fair questions that the deaccessioning conversation raises. I just don't think he's raised any of them yet.
Right. Well, but I mean, to be fair, museums are closing now. I mean, the Met, they claimed at the beginning of the pandemic that they were going to lose $100 million. And obviously hundreds, if not thousands of museum employees all over the place have been let go during the pandemic as a result. So, it's a fair question. Obviously, if you're a private collector, foundation, I do know foundations that do this. And, it's how they pay the bills. So it's a different mission, of course. But I think, there are people that would argue that it's all on the table.
I think the other thing that this, using the Met as the conversation piece, confuses is the Met is a museum with an enormous endowment, which is not true of most museums, but it is true there. And immediately launching into, well, why don't we sell the art, skips past the question of what's the endowment for. And I'm not suggesting the answer is to liquidate the endowment either, but it is a much less culturally significant set of assets because it's money.
Yep.
And, this is something I think that museums and universities are confronting this year as they did 10, 12 years ago.
Yeah.
If you have a rainy day fund, but no matter how hard it rains, you never tap into the rainy day fund, you look elsewhere. Well, then what's the rainy day fund for?
Right. And AAM, for example, is very clear about, despite economic hardship, you're not supposed to sell. I mean, this is as much as, the what you're using the funds for is debated. They're very clear about that much. So, all right, well, let's keep going here.
And it is for puzzles like this that we have revisionist history. My name is Malcolm Gladwell. You're listening to my podcast about things overlooked and misunderstood. This is our 5th season, 5 years of digression, high dudgeon, needless provocation, and my absolute favorite, grand unified theories. In this season of revisionist history, I want to explore our emotional attachment to objects and rituals and tradition, and the way in which those attachments betray us. And in this first episode, I would like to make sense of the strange relationship of the art world to art.
I wonder.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, many people are wondering about the central question about, selling to pay the bills. And I mean, there are literally museums closing right now.
During his 31-year tenure as director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Philippe de Montebello, the Met's 8th and longest-serving director, guided the acquisition of more than 84,000 works of art.
I found this in a video series called Great Museums, an episode from 2010, An Acquiring Mind. Lots of wide-angle shots of marble-floored galleries and gilt-frame paintings. NPR's Susan Stamberg narrates over what sounds like an orchestra right there on the set.
Born in France, educated at Harvard, in 1963, de Montebello brought a background in European painting.
The film runs for an hour. It's about the most famous director of the Met, Philippe de Montebello, descendant of a noble French family. In particular, it's about how much stuff Philippe de Montebello bought during his 31-year tenure as head of the Met. Tapestries, African sculptures, a fabulous Vermeer, an evening gown that's to die for. He even bought things he didn't want to buy.
Philippe has been an incredible director for supporting the acquisitions of objects of great
Paving the way
quality
for
from
the
across
hoarding.
globe.
It goes on and on about
I've actually
the acquiring.
seen this video
To the
before.
point
We
where
watched
you
it in my
wonder, or at
curatorial
least I
meeting
wondered,
a few years
wait,
ago, and it goes into
I
their
didn't have
acquisition
any money.
process, and
Today,
it shows how
nearly
they
2 million objects
vote as a group to
comprising
what
an
acquire, which is a really
encyclopedic
interesting
treasury
idea
of world art
that
are contained in
brings
the
a lot
Met's
of unity
growing
between
collection.
different departments
Apparently,
that might not
I
always
was wrong in the
collaborate.
numbers. Not 1.5 million
So
objects,
you would call it a
2
generally
million objects.
sound process.
Let me give you
Absolutely.
an
I think it's
example.
fantastic that the
Maybe my
curators can
favorite
pitch
example
between each
of this
other
weirdness
the
in the
reason
art
for
world.
acquiring
It
a
has to
gift
do
or
with a
a
public
purchase.
hearing held in July of
so that
1991
everyone's
at the
aware of the
Financial
direction in
Accounting
which
Standards
the
Board,
collecting
better known as the
here is
FASB.
going.
Right.
The FASB
And it's
is
something
the
that we've
Vatican
instituted
of the
actually at
American
Newfields,
accounting
and it's very
profession.
collaborative.
And this
and it
was one
makes
of
a
the
really great
occasional
working
open
environment.
sessions.
Yeah.
The
I mean, I think it is
FASB holds in
interesting
order
to
to
know
share
if the Met
with the
is
broader American
interviewed in
public
this, and I don't know
subjects
if
of
it's because they
grave concern
declined, but
to the accounting universe. The venue was the FASB's Norwalk, Connecticut headquarters. The
I
subject,
think as usual, it sort of raises an
accounting
interesting
for
question.
contributions
At the same
received
time,
and
because,
contributions made and capitalization
and I'll
of
get
works
into
of
the
art,
FAS
historical treasures, and
in
similar
a second,
assets.
but right, I mean, he sort of starts with
Room
the
was
premise that
packed.
the Met and other
They
institutions have this
videotaped the proceedings
brainless
so
acquisition
people
fee,
could watch in the
as though
overflow.
they're not doing, as you said, Rob,
I've read a transcript of the
consideration,
all
particularly given the limited resources. They're
947
not just throwing
pages
cash.
of it. And I would
Because
like
they
to
don't have
direct
it
your attention
go around.
to a particular exchange.
Uh,
It was between
I
the
think
then
it
chairman
was interesting
of
to
the
me that he didn't
FASB,
go into this
Dennis
history because,
Beresford, and a man named
as the
C.
lawyer, and this is one of the things
Douglas
we talked about,
Dillon.
these things are property, of
Dillon
course, and when
was a
you're
tall man,
doing accounting for
patrician,
an
a certain
institution,
stature. He was
they
former
do own these
director of
things, and so how you treat them
the Wall Street
matters.
firm founded by
And
his
they
father,
and
was
in
possessed with
fairness,
maybe the greatest resume
museums
in
receive an
18th
extraordinary
century
benefit in
US
not having to
Treasury
list them on their
Secretary
balance sheet,
in the 1960s,
because that would be
ambassador
practically
to France,
difficult. It would
chair of the
create
Brookings Foundation,
income,
president of the
many
Harvard
business
Board of
issues.
Overseers, a close friend of John Rockefeller III.
So-
Well, yeah, and then
of impressionist art.
then also then you enter into a question about what is the value, because obviously these things fluctuate pretty dramatically, but then more importantly, the moment you put a value on something, it equates it with money as if it's something that can just be liquidated. So and that's again the point of not disclosing that.
But it is tricky because there is an actual market for art. So it's not only a non-monetary item that museums hold, it is a huge monetary item that people also hold. So it has like two different types of value. And I really couldn't, while listening to this, I couldn't think of another object or whether it's oranges or butter or gold that has a similar type of market, or real duality there.
Right.
Beresford had made it plain that he
And it would solve the problem is the other thing. It would, if you could just liquidate something that was in demand and raise funds immediately, it solves the problem, which is why it seems so tantalizing, like it's low-hanging fruit.
Right? I mean, it's C. Douglas freaking Dillon. He does a little preamble, carefully explains how outraged the Met is at the intrusion of accountants into their business, launches into a vivid description of the extraordinary size of the Met's collection, and then, and this is maybe my favorite part of the entire 947-page transcript, Dillon says, quote, "We have a new curator of Islamic art, been with us for a couple years now. We have certainly the greatest collection of Islamic rugs in the Western Hemisphere, one of the 2 or 3 in the world. He has never been able to even see that collection because so much of it is in storage and is so difficult to get out, so costly and time-consuming that he knows by the records what they are, but he hasn't been able to look at them." C. Douglas Dillon is speaking to an audience of accountants. Accountants are people who like to count things. More than that, they are people who believe, as a matter of deep professional principle, that everything can be counted. And they have proposed that the art world agree to start counting things like everyone else. And in response, this pillar of the American establishment shows up in suburban Connecticut and says, "We can't count our things. There's just too many of them. They're all buried somewhere in storage." To give you an example, the guy
As a
who was
registrar,
responsible for our Islamic
I
rug
resent that.
collection, maybe the greatest
Well,
Islamic
right,
rug
because he's
collection
not
in the
saying
world,
that.
mind you,
Yeah.
has never even seen our Islamic
Gladwell
rug
is setting up
collection.
a point that
I have
equates
to
being
say,
seen in public
This is where
with
the art world loses
the
me.
extent of the museum's mission, which I think is one of the fundamental flaws of this podcast, right? Museums exist
So I
as
called up the
repositories of
staffer
cultural
at the
property
FASB who organized that hearing all those
for
long
studies,
years ago.
scholarship,
His
etc.
name is
And those
Ron
rugs he's
Bossy,
talking about
just retired.
may not be seen as a unit public ever, but they
Right.
may be
Yes.
that and discussed by scholars of that
I'm very impressed.
genre of
Bossio
no,
returned
crap.
to his
It's
old offices
important.
at FASB headquarters.
Right,
to
and,
take
and,
my
and it's
call.
also, it's
So
not
he
thinking
would
about
have
the
access
mission
to
of the
critical
institution in
documents.
100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years.
The,
They may not play a
financial
role
statements of
today
the
or tomorrow, but
Museum.
down the road,
And I want to
in terms of scholarship and education, as you say.
I was just wondering if they could be Googled up here as well. but
Yeah,
go ahead.
maybe we can.
He's on his computer, I'm on mine. We're downloading the Metropolitan Museum of Art's 2019 annual report and locating the crucial part, the statements of financial position, beginning on page 44.
I have cash, receivable for investments sold, retail inventories, these are all straightforward. Accounts receivable, straightforward. Contributions receivable. And
That's the pledges.
Financial statements for almost any organization look pretty much the same. You start by listing your assets, everything of value. Then you list your liabilities, loans, mortgages, pension obligations. Then you balance them. That's why it's called a balance sheet. Bossio and I are going down the list of the Met's assets.
Then there's investments, which I'm assuming is the endowment, 3.7.
Could be endowment or it could be just investments in total. They may not
Yeah.
all be part of the endowment.
Then I have fixed assets, 393 million, and then I have collections and I have nothing.
It's supposed to be a precise accounting of everything the Met has of value. The amount the museum made last year from selling stocks, the amount of cash it has on hand, its endowment, the amount it's owed from various creditors, the amount it got in gifts and donations.
The other thing that's not addressed
even
in
the
here
value
is
of the
that
inventory
endowments
in its
can't
gift
all
shop.
be liquidated,
Everything.
period. Like
And they
a lot
add
of
it
that
all
stuff
up,
is
and they
tied
come up with a
in,
number, total assets.
how the money was given and the restrictions
It's next to the line item
that lie
entitled
on it. So
collections. That is
I
to
would have
say,
liked to have seen
the
a little bit of
millions
information about that,
unimaginably rare
or
and
heard
precious art
information.
objects owned
Yeah,
by
I thought this
museums.
was a huge
The 18
simplification
Van
of,
Goghs, the
as he calls it, the
46
balance
Picassos, the
sheet.
20
For
Rembrandts.
example, if you're
There is
caring
no
for an
dollar
object
figure,
or a
nothing.
collection of 50,000
blank.
objects,
All it says
technically
is
they're all worth the exact same amount of money. You're putting just as much money toward a
Note A.
broken
Oh,
chair to
here it
keep it in
is.
storage as you
Note
are for your
A
priceless
in the
Vermeer.
appendix.
So you
It
can't
says,
say the Vermeer
in
is worth
conformity with
$50
accounting
million
policies
and your
generally
chair is worth
followed by art
$5.
museums,
It's
the
still
value of
your
the
cost of
museum's
collecting,
collections has been
which is figuring out how much it
excluded
takes
from the
annually to
statement
care
of
for each
financial
individual
position.
object, should be flat across the board.
Right.
This is a multi-billion-dollar organization with
Yes.
billions and billions of dollars in art, and it's none of it is listed on their financial statement. This seems I don't even understand how that started.
Well, that was, your reaction is similar to the reaction that some of our board members had.
On top of that, it turns out that the Met would rather charge admission, cut exhibitions, and get rid of 90 people than sell anything. Even though they have so many things like Islamic rugs that the guy running the Islamic rug collection hasn't even seen any of his Islamic rugs because they're all in storage somewhere. In fact, most of the Met's collection is in storage.
Well, I think that,
football
what we've
field-sized
seen as a result of
warehouses,
this pandemic, and
presumably somewhere
maybe
in New
what's
Jersey,
really
full
behind
of
the
stuff.
question here is that museums perhaps
And
do
when the
need other
FASB
revenue
says,
streams.
"Why don't you tell us,
5 minutes
like a
after the
normal
lockdown
institution,
here in New
just
York,
how much your stuff is worth?" Because,
most of the
I don't
museums
know,
and
maybe
many
it
of
would be
the
easier to think
supporting
rationally
vendors
about how to run
laid off
things
huge
if you knew
amounts
that
of
fact.
people,
that
and
goes crazy.
they clearly couldn't
Dispatches C. Douglas
afford
Dillon
to pay
to
them
Norwalk, Connecticut, to say,
for even a few
"Never,
months in
not
order
on
to
my watch.
to
We've
stay
never
open.
done that,
And
we
that's just
never
a
will."
level of instability that I don't think I would have expected.
No, this is unlike
like a
any
place
other
like the Met,
business.
who has very public
You're supposed to carry
financial
assets that
issues and
either
has
book or
had for
market
a long
value,
time, as
and
this
you're supposed to
been,
put them in
pointed out
your
here.
financial reports, and they don't.
I
This
think
is Michael
the
O'Hare,
pandemic
who teaches
really
in the
brought
Business
into
School at
light
Berkeley.
the problems that
If you ask
large
anyone
art
who knows
institutions
the way around
should
a
have
balance sheet
encountered or
about
should
the
have
way
addressed a
museums
very
report
long time
their
ago.
assets, you get the
Staffs
Michael
can be
O'Hare
very, very
response.
large.
I was
You
talking
can have
about
very
this at
expensive
some
exhibitions that don't have
conference, and
any
somebody
earned
from the
income.
orchestra, some financial
I think
person
this
from
was
an
kind of a
orchestra
reckoning
said,
that
wait a minute.
I don't want to say nonprofits as
you
a
buy a
whole,
painting
but
and then it just
museums had
disappears?
coming, and the pandemic just
And that's
brought us
what
all to
happened.
the same point at the
There's
same
expense,
time.
Right.
And then that's the last we hear about it in the financial records. It's quite bizarre.
For the longest time, I would bore everyone I met with how strange I found all this. Until one day, I was in Holland on my book tour, in Leiden, out with a bunch of people in a bar. And I told the group the story of the epic showdown between Dennis Beresford and C. Douglas Dillon. And this one guy, a philosopher, said, "Oh, it's like Smaug. Smaug, the dragon from The Hobbit, who sits on a mountain of treasure. Smaug doesn't want to use his gold. He doesn't wear it out to dragon social events. He does not list his holdings on his annual dragon financial statement. He just wants to hoard it." And I'm like, oh my God. Smaug. Yes, that explains everything.
He was an old dragon and a
This is
grey
like a Thomas
stone.
Friedman column, right?
His red
We'll do a
eyes
cab
blinked
driver
as he
in
lay
Riyadh
alone.
to
His
explain
joy
Middle
was
Eastern
dead,
politics
and
to
his
me.
youth spent.
And here's
He was
how.
knobbed and wrinkled, and his limbs bent in the long years to his gold chain. In his heart's furnace the fire
I'll
waned.
also say, particularly if you're an accredited
This is
museum, it is
J.R.R.
definitely not hoarding, because as you can say, John, as a registrar, there's a lot of care that's going into that collection. And I think hoarding makes it sound like it's just these like random piles of things, as opposed to the neat painting racks you have as your background.
Yeah, completely.
That's what happens when a
I
dragon
think
sits on
what
his treasure for too long.
bothers Gladwell, as I understand, is the
And the stuff
principle of
that couldn't
never.
fit under his belly,
Right? The principle that
the
you can
dragon
never
has
open the
buried
door
deep
at all.
inside his lair.
And it's a confounding question. Why never? And the fact is, the answer isn't never, either in practice or in principle, really. And those principles have proven
This
very
episode is
difficult
made
to draw
remarkable
and
by
apply, and they have not been applied.
You know the red wax-tipped bottle but there's more beneath the surface of Maker's Mark.
And the revised guidelines that the AMD out with this year are probably equally applied. I think are probably going to end up undermining the original guidelines.
Yeah.
Because, you open the door a crack and people are sort of like, well, what were we doing that way before again? And I don't want to do it that way anymore.
Right.
And, to get right into it, my case, I think certainly showed the limits of the power of public opprobrium, right? The AMD didn't waste any time saying you can't do this, we're going to sanction you, everything else. The museum said, okay, do your worst.
Yeah.
And never hesitated in brushing off that criticism.
Right. And Mark Gold's point from the other side, he was like, the sanctions kind of didn't affect the museum at all.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know. I mean, I can't comment. I can and wouldn't comment on that in terms of what the after effect is on other interrelations. And, I know from personal experience before I was a lawyer how important those relationships are, and loans and reciprocal things of all sorts make it harder if you're not getting that from other museums. But it doesn't mean you cease to exist either.
Right. But also, like, to your point about, what he's also getting at is, any institution, you see so little at a time. There's very little that's actually of the collection that is actually available to see at any one time. And there's a sense that everything else is lacking in value. And if it lacks in value, then why not get rid of it? And that's a process of deaccessioning that happens all the time, and that re-examination. And certainly some of the major institutions that have done it recently have done so with the mission of creating awareness towards, say, underrepresented, whether, populations that have work that have not been represented in the canon. And which is why it's interesting that Baltimore, for example, decided to stop, and because they had, other, I guess, what is it, Warhol that they wanted to sell, ironically.
Beck
Well, I think
graciously took me upstairs to the
I
archives.
think part of the problem
We're
is
just off the staircase. There were dozens
a lot of people
brown
agree that the
cardboard
idea of
boxes
museums selling
stacked
things back into the private market where they won't be seen again is of.
Oh, they're like.
At the same time, I think what others would say correctly
behind glass
is that the difference in many instances, because if museums sell work of art number 1 and use the proceeds to buy work of art number 2, there's nothing to protect work of art number 1 from to stay in the public eye. And I think these things, Robin, you may have some interesting experience on this. They do end up, unfortunately, being a rich man, poor man sort of thing in the execution, right? So the summer that the Berkshire Museum announced its intention to sell its paintings, MoMA announced it was selling like $250 million worth of photographs or something, right? And they were doing it in accordance with the AMD guidelines. And so I think the obvious question, I posed this in an article I wrote that summer before I got involved in the case, is what's the difference? Why is the photographs, probably even more so, are going to vanish and never be seen again? And that lack of a limiting principle, I think, bothers a lot of people too. And there isn't a clear answer for it. I think what it comes down to, speaking as the lawyer, is what's the mission of the museum, right? Mark's point, which he, I think, says eloquently, is the mission of the museum's trustees to ensure the survival of the institution. I don't view it quite the same way. I think the trustees' obligation is to ensure the mission of the institution, and I don't think that the right way to do that is to keep the building open at all costs. Taking it to its extremes. An empty building with open doors is of no value to anybody, even if it's still the Museum of Art X. And the world can't support all museums as originally conceived, but the world can support, I think, a lot of the missions of those museums as originally conceived.
And I think for individual institutions that do deaccession, to use your MoMA example, they're a museum of modern art. I mean, modern art's been created in the 30 minutes we've been talking. So that is a really evolving area in which they are tasked as an institution to continue collecting. Is 1945 modern anymore? That was a long time ago at this point. We're getting close to 100 years. So is that when at one point will we be looking back at Dolly and saying he's an old master? So depending on your institution really depends on how your collection should be living. And I do view collections as living. And I think deaccessioning is part of the life cycle of institutions, particularly if the collection is there to support your mission and not the other way around. And the collection needs to be reflective of that mission. And institutions have missions that change, and that's voted upon by the board. And maybe that means that you're going to deaccession so that the collection is more reflective of the strategic plan, your collecting plan, all these plans and policies that hopefully your institution has in place when you do decide to deaccession, because they all kind of have to support each other.
Well, yeah, and even as a hypothetical, what if a museum just existed only as a repository, and it never actually had exhibitions? It was just storage. And so the idea being that the value comes 100% from preservation and not from presentation. And then does that shift public perspective? I mean, if you just establish that as your mission, then you're 100% hoarding, right? But then it's also done so for the public good, and but the public good is debatable, right?
Well, and I think one of the things that's interesting, and I think one thing that Baltimore deserves credit for, is they were very candid about what they were doing and why they were doing it. They didn't pretend, we're not really selling it for this or that. And they weren't, this came up in the context of the revised guidelines, but they weren't selling it by claiming financial hardship.
John continued
we are redirecting our purpose in some extent.
that once belonged to a fan somewhere.
And we've done that similarly at Newfields. We haven't monetized the collection, but what we have is created a new collecting plan. We've figured out as a curatorial department and as an interpretation department how we would like to reimagine the galleries. And we've also come up with a cost of collecting. How much does it cost to care for each individual object, which, as I said earlier, is the same amount, whether it's the broken chair or, well, we don't have a Vermeer, but we'll say the Rembrandt. That is the same number. And I think then you can use a cost of collecting to figure out financially how you as an institution can be existing 30 years from now and 100 years from now, no matter what your mission might be and should it be changing. You can only keep the doors up depending on finances, not depending on whether you have that Rembrandt or broken chair. So I think there's a financial piece here that Gladwell doesn't address in the podcast. And I think a lot of us that are art historians or collection specialists are maybe a little too altruistic about, because we love art and we love our collections, but they cease to exist if you can't keep your finances above board.
Right.
In fact, I just word searched flea market.
We were talking over the section about Andy Warhol and the Warhol Museum and how they preserve all of the things that he collected, all the tchotchkes and things that he bought at the market. So I don't think we missed anything. I mean, it was more to support his case about the hoarding and seeming lack of curation of the things that he collected. So now they're discussing how he acquired things.
Simon knew Andy Warhol.
So
and the flea market where he hung out.
It was a protean flea market. It kept growing.
But again, this is
antithetical
to the way museums operate. Obviously it's even if you've never seen all of the Islamic rugs in your collection,
I remember seeing
they weren't acquired haphazardly.
It was just a place that you
What this segment, the flea market, made me think of was my time when I was at the Smithsonian at American History. And there was a collection of Katrina objects that had come in, and the curator had gone to New Orleans and collected soggy toys or signs that people had been putting on their roofs to direct help to come to them. And I don't mean to equate that to a flea market, because it was obviously a very horrific event. But would Malcolm be as cavalier to say to the Smithsonian Museum of American History to say, hey, I think you should deaccession these there was a muddy Playmobil castle that I remember in storage near where I worked. would he say that to the curator of that collection that obviously has a much more emotional and impactful like human history behind it, as opposed to saying, hey, deaccession your Turkish rugs? It made me really reflect on how I think fine art is put under a really different lens in terms of monetization than collections that I don't want to say are based on ephemera, but are material history, and speak to particularly our American history.
Yeah. Well, and all of this, sort of starts from the question, which itself has the assumption of a certain level of activity, exhibitions, and everything else, right? And I've worked at a very financially stable museum. I've been a trustee at a museum that was hand to mouth every 10 minutes. And to some extent, like anything else, you got to balance the checkbook. You got to know what you can and can't do. And if you assume that you have to keep doing major blockbuster exhibitions or large things of a certain scale, and then the question is how do you pay for it? Well, then you're going to make the question of whether you can sell the art. If you are content to be publicly available, find a way to pay the electric bill, and even at that, you're not necessarily going to force these hard questions.
And then I just went and bought one of those.
I think we're also arriving at the same conclusion that monetizing the collection actually involves selling it, and that doesn't actually have to be the case. Of course, there's admission fees for special exhibitions. That does happen, but I mean, there's other ways. I mean, because if you do think of it purely as an asset, and if a museum is purely a business, that is like one of the best things. So you can, why not increase your loan fees, for example? I mean, this is, we could make it more available is my point. Yeah. I mean, there's other ways to look at monetization of the collection.
Or
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Finding ways to have more earned revenue, and that could be through having a winter light show, which is something that we do at Newfields, and which we've definitely come under fire for Disneyfying the campus, but that then supports our acquisitions and our public programs and our ability to participate in loans and ask for loans. And it is definitely a stool that requires a whole lot of different legs to hold it up. And we don't work in ivory towers. And the fact that we still poo-poo museums for finding creative ways to make money is, I find really infuriating because when museums say they don't need to make money is when they find problems.
Well, what that light show did was take deaccessioning off the table. I mean, maybe it's not directly correlated, but I mean, it made it less of an issue. So
we even have the box after he died at the hospital of his clothing and his final effects that were left at the hospital. We have that box preserved as it was picked up from the hospital. So
that actually sounds very important to me. Andy Warhol's final
that he wore to the hospital
belongings
for that final visit. The backpack, exactly how it was packed.
So it has like
all of his glasses and the business card for his doctor in the front pocket.
Different than the significance of the work of
I don't mean
art.
to pick on the Warhol Museum, but this is what all art museums do. During his tenure running the Met, Philippe de Montebello.
And if you go to the Warhol Museum, if you have a museum dedicated to one person and they don't have that stuff,
majority of which were packed away in boxes and sent to storage in New Jersey, never to be seen again.
Leave alone this idea that
that's not any different from the mountain of detritus in cardboard boxes.
It's really facile, right? I mean, because I think we were sort of struggling before to think of other examples. Well, what about a library, right? Like the value of a library is not proportional mathematically. You have the number of books or divided by 3 or 4 or whatever else. The value is in the existence of it as a resource.
Right.
Nobody says, well, there's this book that nobody's ever taken out. So why do we even have that? Because somebody might want to read it someday. That's the point.
That's a great example because that's an institution that continues to collect too. So while you're not parting with books that aren't checked out, you're also not going to say, it's been a tough year. I'm not going to acquire anything published in 2020.
Yeah.
Well, it also works to my hypothetical example too, because again, selling books doesn't necessarily make you money unless it's a rare book, but then also, the value is 100% in, in the hoard, if you will. So,
Yeah.
Whether you're doing $1 million or
so,
hundreds of millions in revenue, join the over.
I mean, I think it's clear that, you know, we all are sort of on the same page about, you know, the podcast seems to be missing the point of institutions collecting cultural assets as opposed to monetary assets. But, you know, I mean, we've still been able to sort of point out how it's still a complicated issue because, you know, if it were a private collector that needed to fund some stuff, they might just call the collection and sell it. And, you know, it also calls into question, you know, who determines what the value. I mean, as a curator, Robin, I mean, this actually points to you. Like, you're actively deciding what creates value or what is worth preserving. Let me put it that way. And so, therefore, we have to decide what's worth preserving, what's worth collecting. You're right.
I don't actually really like the word preserving because that makes it sound like it is staying in storage and not going to be. It sounds like you're like canning vegetables and hiding away in your basement for a bad day. I think of it as being more selective in terms of what you're going to collect, first of all, in terms of your financial ability to continue to support the objects that you're bringing in. And when you are able to put a number to how much each individual object counts, it does make you a little more selective, but also ensuring that your collecting plan has a direction for what not only do you want to continue to collect, but the stories that you'd like to continue to tell or retell in the gallery in a new way. And we've undergone a complete assessment of what was a 50,000 piece collection. And we've deaccessioned close to 7,000 objects since 2015 because they don't fit within that collecting plan and in the direction in which we would like the institution to go. And that is everyone's decision. That's every curator that has ranked their collection. It is the art committee's decision and the director's decision and the board of trustees' decision. It's not one person saying, hey, I'm the director of the museum and I'd really like to do XYZ. These 5 pieces are going to go. It's a much more critical assessment of the long range goals of the museum.
Right. Century paintings, sculptures, busts, antiques, lamps, jewelry, and more. End quote.
Right, and that's a very good point, right? Because he's Montebello as sort of the narrative driving point, which is just sort of like the great man theory of history. Like, okay, but there are hundreds of other people involved here who are informing and in fact making these decisions.
Right.
And that's not to say that there aren't. And this is where I think deaccessions are tricky, and Malcolm doesn't make this point either. Maybe because he has an hour, maybe because he doesn't work in a museum. But while there are a lot of headlines about poor deaccession decisions, the people that typically don't have headlines are the ones that do make good deaccession decisions or continually see deaccession. I know we were in the New York Times, but I know plenty of other museums that also have active deaccession programs. And very often it's not to make $20 million at Christie's. So they're not in the headlines. They're getting rid of that $5 chair in storage that costs just as much to take care of as the Vermeer. So no one's going to slap someone's hand for wanting to get those objects out the door. But that's a really critical part of collections care. Tracking the objects, doing your inventory, and when you do have the processes that are really up to date, whether it's your policies, procedures, or inventories, you can make the decisions about deaccessioning that are really above board. But I couldn't stress enough how important it is to have an art committee, a board of trustees, or collections committee, as most institutions call it, that are entirely aware of the direction the museum is going in, that are super engaged in the meetings and are always appraised about what's coming in and what's going out. It is wholly reliant on the knowledge of the people that you do select to have on your board. I think a lot of boards get into trouble when they are, especially art museums can be very fun boards to be on, and the art committee is always the golden ticket. No one wants to really be on the finance committee. Everyone wants to be on the art committee, and it isn't something that should be given out as a prize for a donor that's giving you a lot of money. It should be for someone that will help you steer your institution.
Well, yeah, and because selling things is only one way of deaccessioning. It could be repatriation, which is I'm sure Nick, you've dealt with that, but it's like that that's where you really need the expertise, and that's where you really need the knowledge coming from your board, because those decisions are massive and they don't happen in a vacuum. So
look, board composition is so important because you do need a mixture, right? You need a mixture of people who can supply resources. There's just no getting around that. But you also need a mixture of people who, have a passion for the mission and understand the details and want to do the work, particularly in something like an acquisition committee, or and or making deaccessioning decisions, who can digest and use the details.
Well, also like these, I mean, my question is, should these policies that say AAM or AAMD design be more ambiguous just because, just to allow for the variation in the missions of each institution? Is it enough to have sort of an unwritten rule that, we operate like this, where we don't sell collections in order to pay the bills? But, what if the mission of your institution allows for that? I mean, maybe you're just not getting accredited, or maybe you're not a part of AAMD, but I don't know.
I don't know either. And look, one of the ironies, of course, is that very few museums directors are members of AAMD.
It's like 260 something. Yeah, it's
which it is what it is. But, and if you look at the New York rules from the Board of Regents, which is the only state that has any actual legal teeth to this, it is a bit more flexible in terms of an object that's no longer consistent with the mission of your collection. It doesn't compel a one-to-one use of the dollars. It essentially says if this object, if you're the Andy Warhol Museum and you have, photograph of me for some reason, you can deaccession it because that's not the mission of your institution. And that does give some flexibility. To use the Baltimore example, the trustees who ultimately have the authority to say what the mission of the institution is, say, we're changing the mission or we're revising it, you can do that. So that's certainly a little more flexible than the AAMD rules. Right. And which is important because of, the moral suasion of the AAMD rules and the AAM rules is important everywhere, but New York is particularly important because of the center of gravity, and so those New York laws are.
And we're only talking about art because of the financial side and also the nature of the podcast we're listening to, but these regulations, and this is only pertinent to AAM, but these regulations are wildly different for non-art museums, where deaccessions take on a different role. Now, I come from an art background, so I couldn't really get into the nitty-gritty of that, but I do recognize that it's wildly different. All right, let's get back to where
most people would look at this and see a mess, he told Frost on one of their visits to his penthouse. And then he said, really, it's layered and complex. Their penthouses were so overwhelmed with stuff.
He's talking
about
the twins that were hoarders that had
which were also overwhelmed
vast amounts of stuff that
but they
apparently
couldn't part with any of it. It would be too great a loss.
Kind of went down to their psychology as to why they collected it in order to remember specific things, which is exactly why what we're talking about, right? Just like, even though it might seem insignificant or have very little monetary value, some of these things do point to a certain memory, which is why you have a Playmobil toy from Hurricane Katrina, right?
Hoarding and away from their apartments.
Yeah.
I mean, what were they like?
Oh, they were fun. They were fascinating. They knew something about everything. They were both delightful people.
If you talk to a layperson, they would probably think of hoarding as a kind of mental illness. I'm imagining. It's not a mental illness. It's not a deficit that affects all aspects of your functioning.
Yeah. The way I describe it sometimes is a form of giftedness. There's a gift associated with this, an appreciation for the physical world, an appreciation for the emotional experience.
To make an art world equivalent to this, this very much reminded me of Herb and Dorothy Vogel. And if you've ever seen their documentary and what their apartment looked like in New York, and they were voracious collectors of art on his postal service worker salary.
Which is exactly
so that's what these
that
twins
Simon
kind of
Doonan
reminded
made
me
about
of.
Andy Warhol.
Right.
Well, and you don't know what's going to
aspect of him was that he
change,
was
right? I
very
mean, I'll give you. So I used to work at the Clark
example.
Art Institute, and I don't speak for the Clark.
If everyone's not
But you know, the Clark, like the Frick or other places like that, you know, is the function of the taste of particular pair of people.
These drag queens, you know,
and that has significance. It's interesting to you as an indication of who these people were. It also has significance because tastes, you know, come and go. I mean, Clark was very savvy in buying impressionist paintings when they were plummeting out of avant-garde favor in the early 20s, right? Because they were seen as, you know, sort of 2 generations ago contemporary art and sort of boring, right? And people have their opinions about the various impressionists, and they still do. But it's possible that they, in an alternate universe, never came back into film, you know, and it would be like the Museum of Thomas Kincaid, right? But it wasn't. It turned out not to be. It turned out to be a very shrewd decision. We know that now. That was not obvious in 1928 or 1950 even, right? Particularly when he opened the museum, right? Not only was it out of favor when he bought the painting, a generation later, you know, representational art at all was really taken down. So,
well, yeah, exactly. It's the Herb and Dorothy thing. I mean, they collected.
And the reason I raise the example is this is the sort of foundational story of the Clark that Carl Weston and Lane Faison, who were the Williams directors, went down because Weston's roommate was Clark's lawyer. He didn't know anything about art, and he said, "My client, he has all these paintings in his apartment by some guy named Lee Neuer." And Weston said, "Okay, we'll write down." That was where it started, right? But if you visited their apartment, you would sound like Malcolm Gladwell. You'd say these hoarders, these old people, they've got all these paintings stacked up all around their apartment. It's dusty and dirty. People must be crazy. You know, not so much.
Because the investment paid off, and they're charming. So we certainly view that very differently. But it was absolutely a hoarder mentality. But they were collecting pieces that they loved because of its monetary value, which is actually very similar to art museums.
Yep. Right. We're in the final phases here of the podcast.
Connecticut, and stood up before the Vatican of Accounting and said, "We cannot tell you what we have in our collections. That is not the way our imaginations
We won't tell you."
And the Vatican backs down. The accountants realize that this is a battle they cannot win, with the result that on virtually every American art museum balance sheet, there is some version of Note A. In conformity with accounting policies generally followed by art museums, the value of the museum's collections has been excluded from the statement of financial position.
So he also doesn't mention how dangerous it is to actually reveal the value of your individual artworks. I certainly wouldn't want a gallery for someone to walk in and say, "I know that's $20 million. I know that's $200,000. That's a major security problem."
And an expense problem, by the way, right? Because, okay, you could say this, you know, Titian is worth X, but all the stuff he's complaining about in storage, you're going to hire an appraiser to appraise each, you know, piece of furniture and decorative arts every year.
Yeah, impossible.
Unless that's going to be a cost driver. That's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think.
And it couldn't even be done in a year. Like even
right, and it would take
yeah.
forever. Even if you did it every 5 years, every 10 years. And, and most of the time.
All right. Less than a minute left here.
Revisionist History is produced by Mia Lobel and Lee Mengistu, with Jacob Smith, Eloise.
My thoughts here, now that this is basically over, I mean,
our editor is
I guess we didn't really need the whole thing in order to get to our main feelings about it. However, I mean, but I mean, what does it actually mean for the future? And you know, given our current situation, you know, we're using the podcast as the protagonist to raise the question about deaccessions, and you know, with things like AAMD's resolution. I mean, most people think that they're not going to go back to their old stance, at least 100%. Maybe they'll leave more doors open now. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on how we go from here? Go ahead and start, Robin, if you don't mind.
Well, I know my institution is a member of AAMD, and our director has been quite involved. So I had heard through the grapevine for a while that they were hoping to come up with some sort of statement that aligned, not wholly, but was more united with AAM's white paper. Now, the big difference being is that AAM is for all sorts of different collections, whereas AAMD is specifically for art museums. And again, I think this kind of points to the public perception of how art museums are different than material culture, or we'll use American history museums again as another example. It is very much perceived as an ivory tower, and as Gladwell uses as an example here, it's the Met that he's mentioning should be deaccessioning as opposed to the American History Museum or the Natural History Museum right down the road from the Met. So art museums are so often pointed to as hoarders of these works that are worth millions of dollars. They are worth a lot of money, but their mission and reason for collecting is no different than a natural history museum or American history museum, which is always, to fulfill a mission and to educate the public that wants to come and visit and research the collections. So it is always my hope that art museums can be a little bit more accepted in the world of deaccessions when they do proceed with a level of caution and awareness of their collection, their mission, their strategic plan, their collecting plan. I think Newfields is a great example of how you can launch into not necessarily an inventory, but a critical review of your entire holdings that will help you look toward the future. I think museums as a whole, and the pandemic has really brought this into very clear focus, are at a real turning point where we have been, as a whole, pushing large exhibitions that come from another continent that are incredibly expensive. They don't bring in the crowds, they don't bring in a lot of money. And while that is a way in which we've proceeded for 100 some odd years in some cases, it's not necessarily how the rest of the 21st century should unfold. And I'm hoping as we come out on the other side of this pandemic and AAM maybe comes out with a more permanent statement of some sort that relates to deaccessioning, is that our institutions, museums or art museums or otherwise, will find new and creative ways of embracing what it means to be a museum. We're still going to collect, we're still going to deaccession, we're still going to have a board of trustees and missions and what is really the foundational aspects of what makes a museum. But financially and programmatically and collecting wise, I think museums are at a really, it's an interesting time to be involved in a museum, pandemic or not. We just find ourselves on a very even playing field all of a sudden after having been shut down for a long time, or some museums that haven't even opened again. So I'm hoping that the rest of the 21st century brings a really new and creative way to look at what it means to be a museum.
Nick, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's no question we're not going back to the way it was. I don't think it's possible. I think that's not the way the world works. And I think the challenge is going to be, again, I'm speaking as a lawyer, I think about norms and rules, but the challenge is going to be, how do we articulate guidance, if not regulation, that encourages the long-term survival of museums? Right? There is always financial pressure. Museums are nonprofits. Most of them exist right on the margin each year, and that's a function of their scope. I know people who are on the board of the ICA, and they've told me, Nick, it's no different than Podunk Museum X. At the end of the year, you get a checkbook, and the trustees give till it hurts. But so that can't always be the excuse. And I think the reason these rules have evolved is because there's always financial pressure, and simply saying, well, we have this property that we could sell for a lot of money, which would solve our financial problem today, giving into that is usually a bad idea because you'll have the same problem next year. Mm-hmm. And I think, as you say, Robin, the level playing field is a good thing to think about. And I think about this, again, this isn't as a lawyer with any particular expertise, but to think about really what's within your means. What's your mission, right? There's absolutely nothing wrong with a museum that very few people go to, that is financially stable, that is a resource for its community, right? I mean, the most important institution in the history of my life is the local library, right? Where I went when I was 5 and 6 years old. And there were 3 other people there when I went, right? But that institution had a profound effect on me. That institution still exists because they didn't try to do a $50 million blockbuster exhibition of the Gutenberg Bible, right? And so I think the challenge will be, I think the current guidance doesn't work. I think the reason that these crises keep popping up is because they don't work for everybody involved. And, how do we come up with guidance that encourages people to be prudent and long-sighted? And I think I'm grateful for this opportunity. I think conversations like this are how we do better.
Great. Well, I think it's also certainly showed that. So even though most of our museums have closed, and even the ones that have opened up to a certain degree, with limited capacity and everything, it certainly proves that nobody's wanting these institutions to go away. And to your point about the library, just because we can't open our museums right now doesn't mean they're not important. And so, if anything, we recognize how important they are, and even if nobody goes to it, it still remains important. So, listen, I appreciate your time and having this discussion, even if we couldn't get into every little nuanced detail, but I think it's important that we address it, because it's, again, as you point out, it's not going to go away. It's going to continue to happen. The crises are going to continue to happen. So. Hopefully, we can all get on board with similar policies about, collections care as we go forward. So thanks again so much to Robin and Nick for your time and listening to this podcast with us and commenting on it. And with that, everybody, please subscribe to ARCS on YouTube so that you get notifications whenever we put up new videos like this. And we're happy to put this out as a podcast as well. Thanks again.